Coming up, President Yoon's overseas trip to Southeast Asia continues as he will be attending a G20 meeting on Tuesday. The president spent Monday working on economic diplomacy. We have what he said while addressing business leaders and what it meant. A highly anticipated meeting between China's leader Xi Jinping and President Biden took place on Monday, with the two apparently having a blunt conversation. Topics discussed include Taiwan, the war in Ukraine, and North Korea's missile tests. Plus, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy visits the regained city of Kherson. The citizens of the war-torn city were filled with joy despite having no electricity or running water. Good morning. Welcome to New Day at Arirang. We begin this morning as one of the biggest events in multilateral summit diplomacy is about to kick off in Bali, where a welcoming ceremony will be underway soon for world leaders gathering for the G20 summit. South Korean President Yoon will be speaking on food and energy security, as well as global health during the sessions. Eyes are on whether there will be a one-on-one between President Yoon and his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping. But before that, President Yoon wrapped up his first day yesterday filled with summits related to the G20. The South Korean leader spent the most of the day carrying out his Southeast Asia economic diplomacy, expanding ties and building stronger supply chains. Our editor-in-chief Moon Gun-young, who's traveling with the president, starts us off this morning.
Digital transformation led by the private sector. President Yoon proposed it as a solution to the multifaceted crisis the world faces today at the business arm of the Group of 20 dialogue in Bali Monday. Identifying the current crisis as one triggered by shock on the supply side during the recovery of the pandemic, supply chain disruptions, and an array of geopolitical conflicts, Yoon suggested digital transition to achieve supply-side innovation.
디지털 기술이 기존의 산업 데이터와 결합하며 비용 절감과 동시에 새로운 가치를 창출해 나가는 과정에서 끊임없이 새로운 비즈니스가 발생하고 있습니다.
This is in line with his earlier proposal in New York in September, where he called for the establishment of a new digital order.
누구도 소외되지 않고 디지털 시대의 혜택을 공유할 수 있도록 BA.4가 중심이 돼서 인류가 공감하는 디지털 질서를 정립해 나가기를 기대합니다.
President Yoon also took his first step in executing the economic agenda of South Korea's new Indo-Pacific strategy, with the key word being diversification. Yoon and Indonesian President Joko Widodo met with economic policymakers, government officials, and business leaders of both countries to discuss investment and supply chain cooperation at a South Korea-Indonesia business roundtable.
This is South Korea's first economic cooperation with the Southeast Asian countries since we are unveiling our new South Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative. Our government plans to promote this economic cooperation based on diversification that is expanding our ties to all ASEAN nations and building supply chain resilience.
On Tuesday, President Yoon takes part in the main event at the summit of the Group of 20, where he'll come face-to-face with leaders of the world's major advanced and emerging economies in the multilateral framework. One of them will be Chinese President Xi Jinping. With South Korea having unveiled its new Indo-Pacific strategy and its stance on rules-based international order based on freedom and value, it may be opportune for both leaders to break the ice and sit down for a bilateral here on this Indonesian island this tour around. Still, no confirmation yet on whether there's been a decision. Moon Gun-young, Arirang News, Bali.
So now let's break down how President Yoon's overseas trip to Southeast Asia has been so far with Mason Ritchie, Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Well, it's always good to see you. And as we've heard, President Yoon stressed that no country should be kind of left behind in global digital transformation and offered to take the lead to ensure this does not happen. How convincing was Yoon's appeal to other nations on a topic that he chose himself?
Yeah, so these kinds of large-scale initiatives are, of course, at first vague and they're unclear in terms of the details, and other nations will, I think, want to take a wait-and-see attitude about how much priority this gets going forward. Presumably, in this particular case, it will be a lot. Why digital? In the first place, of course, it refers to technology, where Korea has a strong role to play. In the second place, there's an economic security dimension to this, which obviously is increasingly important. And then thirdly, this is a business-related issue, and private sector led, or at least this is a significant part of it. It also, in some ways, fits in with some of the elements of the South Korean Indo-Pacific strategy, which has been slowly rolled out during the swing through Southeast Asia. And then why inclusive? Obviously, this is possibly a message to China to say that South Korea is aware of China's concerns about being excluded out of certain groupings in the region. This fits in with a global pivotal state concept that the Yoon administration wants to work on, where choosing an area and being a leader in that sort of universal important area, I think, is significant. It also speaks to developing nations. But overall, I think the rest of the world will take a wait-and-see attitude and see how well this is developed going forward.
Right. Now, I want to shift the focus to the Trilateral summit between South Korea, Japan, and U.S. It doesn't seem like anything new was said, but the three did agree to kind of share intelligence on missile launches, as North Korea has been stepping up. And is this a step towards a positive relationship between South Korea and Japan specifically? In the first place, I think there is something significant in this discussion or this release of discussion about sharing the missile launch information, and that's that the statement refers to that sharing of information being made in real time, which means we would be going beyond the GSOMIA agreement, the General Security of Military Information Agreement, which already exists between South Korea and Japan. So I think there maybe is a little bit something new there. I think that there's a message to China there and also to North Korea. The message to North Korea is one of increasing extended deterrence and cooperation among the three allies to shore that up in the face of North Korea's continuing development of its nuclear and missile program. The message to China is that this is a small first incremental step towards greater Japan, U.S., South Korea cooperation on missile defense, which China won't like going forward. And so here the hidden message, I think, or the not so hidden message in some ways, is that China should take some type of effort to rein in North Korea unless it wants to see this trilateral cooperation, which frankly, Beijing considers to be a kind of a nightmare scenario. Whether or not this speaks much to Seoul-Tokyo relations improving, going forward, I think most of the problems there are bilateral. So this is really more of a trilateral initiative, but it probably does speak, at least in some ways, to how things have improved since Yoon and Kishida have come into office compared to the time when, for instance, Moon and Abe were leading their respective nations. Right, and speaking of China, President Yoon and South Korea are clearly an ally with the U.S., especially in the face of North Korean provocations. However, there is a chance you might be meeting with President Xi Jinping in person during this trip. How do you think this summit would unfold if it does happen?
So in some ways, that would be a feather in the cap of Yoon to have managed to have a meeting with Xi, although I wouldn't be, in my estimation, too happy about that in some ways if I were South Korea. It might be a bit of a poisoned chalice. The fact is, since Yoon has come into office, against the expectations of many experts and analysts, China has actually been relatively benign vis-a-vis South Korea. It hasn't put pressure on South Korea, particularly economically, rhetorically, or diplomatically, despite some developments in the improvement of the relations between Seoul and Washington and Seoul and Tokyo that Beijing probably isn't very happy about. There are a lot of reasons for why that's the case, but I think a number of people expect that probably not to last for very long. And indeed, there are some areas of real disagreement involving security of economic and technology, relations between U.S., South Korea, and the rest of the world. There are issues involving, as we just talked about, the trilateral cooperation between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan. The fact is, China's been, relatively benign in terms of its neglect of South Korea, and I think that that's not necessarily such a bad thing. So if I were Yoon, I would actually be relatively cautious about even wanting to have a meeting. Don't poke the bear unless you're absolutely required to.
Right. I mean, it is a complicated situation at the moment as everyone is there. Thank you again for your insights this morning, and I hope you have a great day, Professor.
Great, you as well. Thank you for having me.
Now, on the sidelines of the G20 summit, U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping met for the first time since Biden took office. Although tensions over North Korea and Taiwan were evident during discussions, both leaders agreed on goodwill gestures to improve their ties. Ji-young has the details.
In a 3-hour meeting aimed at improving ties, U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping had some tense moments over Taiwan and North Korea. The leaders of the two superpowers engaged in blunt talks on Monday in Bali, a day before the kickoff of the G20 summit, which marked their first in-person meeting since President Biden took office. President Biden said that he told his Chinese counterpart that Beijing has an obligation to talk its neighbor North Korea out of launching missiles and conducting nuclear tests and to take responsible actions. But he added it's difficult to say that China could control North Korea.
I made it clear to President Xi Jinping that I thought they had an obligation to attempt to make it clear to North Korea that they should not engage in long-range nuclear tests. And I made it clear as well that if they did, they, meaning North Korea, that we would have to take certain actions that would be more defensive on our behalf. And
he said that should there be any reprisal, it would not be directed against China, but it would send a clear message to North Korea that the U.S. would defend America as well as its allies. The two leaders also clashed over Taiwan, with President Xi defining Taiwan as the first red line that should not be crossed in U.S.-China relations. But President Biden said that the U.S. policy on Taiwan has not changed.
We're going to compete vigorously, but I'm not looking for conflict. I'm looking to manage this competition responsibly. And I want to make sure that every country abides by the international rules of the road. We discussed that. The One China policy, our One China policy has not changed. We oppose unilateral change in the status quo by either side, and we're committed to maintaining the peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait.
But President Biden added he does not believe China would invade Taiwan. Despite tensions, both sides agreed on the need to find the right direction for improving their bilateral relationship.
As always, I am ready to have a candid and in-depth exchange of views with Mr. Biden on issues of strategic importance in China-US relations and on major global and regional issues.
President Biden also stressed that there's no need for a new Cold War with China, saying that he looks forward to continuing an ongoing, open, and honest dialogue to manage differences. Ji-young, Arirang News.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has paid a visit to the newly liberated city of Kherson, where he vowed the fight would continue until all occupied territories were reclaimed. Russian forces withdrew from the area last week. Kim Yo-sun has the details.
Ukrainian flags were raised in Kherson city, celebrating the end of the Russian occupation, which had lasted for more than 6 months. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy arrived in the city on Monday and took part in an official flag-raising ceremony.
I'm honored to be together here with you in our beloved Ukraine's Kherson region, and it is such a warm feeling despite the weather. It is a very heartwarming feeling.
During his visit to the city, Zelenskyy greeted local residents and Ukrainian soldiers. He also stressed that it's very important to bring the city back and to bring back the country's armed forces and its flag. Zelenskyy then commemorated fallen soldiers, expressing gratitude for their sacrifices. Kherson was one of the 4 regions the Kremlin declared it had annexed last month. Nevertheless, Russian forces fled the city last week, which is Russia's 3rd major retreat since its invasion of Ukraine in February. Against this backdrop, the UN General Assembly approved a resolution calling for Russia to be held responsible for violating international law by invading its neighbor. The resolution, which passed Monday, urges Moscow to compensate for the damage and loss of life during the war. It was supported by 94 countries of the Assembly's 193 members, with over a dozen of countries, including Russia, China, and Iran, voting against the resolution. While the resolution is not legally binding, it does represent international opinion and demonstrates widespread opposition to Moscow's military aggression. Kim Hye-sun, Arirang News.
The growing demand for electric vehicles and the batteries that power them has countries looking to secure supplies of lithium and other key minerals. The U.S. and the EU are seeking to reduce their dependence on China in this area, and so the South Korean government and private sector are working together to take the lead in the race to secure the country's place in the EV battery supply chain. Our Lee Dae-yeon reports.
Rechargeable batteries, or secondary batteries, are essential for electric vehicles. And to produce them, minerals like lithium are needed. South Korea is putting more effort into becoming a frontrunner in the global race to secure important elements used in EV production. As part of these efforts, the country's steel-making giant POSCO Holdings built a lithium mining plant in Salar de Hombre Muerto, located at an altitude of 4,000 meters in Argentina's Salta province.
This is just the beginning for POSCO Group to strengthen our secondary battery material business and a milestone for the 100-year-old corporation's future goals.
And even the technology required to extract materials from used secondary batteries has been developed in Korea too.
Smelting reduction technology can recover over 90% of lithium and 95% of nickel and cobalt out of used batteries. We aim to contribute to the development of a resource circular economy.
There's also a company that has developed technology that can make the process of producing secondary batteries more than 85% efficient in terms of power used during manufacturing.
This major electric energy transition technology brings high efficiency by minimizing losses.
But there are rising concerns too, as Washington recently announced rules that include giving EV buyers a tax break for cars with batteries made with minerals mined or processed in the U.S. or country and regions with free trade agreements in place. Because South Korea heavily relies on China for battery materials, the government and the industry plan to establish a one-team strategy to overcome what's seen as a crisis for the industry.
As countries like the US and those in the EU are seeing the secondary battery industry as a means of economic security, the government and the private sector should cooperate strategically to expand the market.
Specifically, the plans include battery makers and the government cooperating on the whole process, from excavating and smelting to supply minerals. By working together, the government aims to increase South Korea's global market share to 40% in 2030, becoming world leaders in the market. Lee Dae-yeon, Arirang News.
South Korea began administering additional Pfizer vaccines specifically targeting BA.4 and BA.5 Omicron variants. Health officials are encouraging people to get the shots as the nation is now in the 7th wave of COVID-19. Our Lee Si-hoo explains further.
Beginning Monday, South Korea is administering an additional bivalent COVID-19 booster, the Pfizer vaccine that specifically targets the BA.4 and BA.5 Omicron variants. This is in addition to the Moderna and Pfizer shots that target the BA.1 variant. The shots are available to adults 18 and over who have completed their primary series of vaccinations or caught COVID-19 at least 4 months ago. But people who had COVID-19 at least 4 months ago must also have completed their primary series of vaccinations. South Korean health authorities on Monday strongly encouraged people to get vaccinated for the winter, explaining that the resurgence has begun in South Korea.
Recently, the number of infections has risen, marking the 7th resurgence of COVID-19. The number of critically ill patients and deaths is also on an increasing trend, rising more than 1.6 and 2 times respectively than that from a month ago.
The statistics website Our World in Data says as of Sunday that South Korea had the world's highest 7-day average of new cases per million people. This is among countries with more than 500,000 people. For every million people in South Korea, there were around 996 new cases. Taiwan recorded the next highest at around 877, followed by Hong Kong at 734. South Korea reported 23,765 new COVID-19 cases on Monday. That's the highest number reported on a Monday in 9 weeks. There are 413 who are severely ill and there were 44 more deaths. Lee Si-hoo, Arirang News.
For a look at the news from around the world, we now turn to our Matthew Ashley standing by at the Arirang newsroom. Good morning.
Good morning, Doyon.
Now let's start in Turkey, where dozens have been arrested following a deadly bomb attack.
Well, that is right. 46 people have been arrested in connection with a deadly blast in Turkey's largest city of Istanbul on Sunday. Now, according to local authorities, among those arrested is a Syrian woman suspected of planting a bomb. Turkish officials have called the explosion a terrorist attack. Istanbul police allege that the woman suspect has links to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK. The party has denied any connection with the latest bombing. The explosion occurred at a popular shopping and tourism area in the bustling Istiklal Avenue. At least 6 people were killed and another 81 were wounded in the blast. Now, a court in the Iranian capital of Tehran has issued its first death sentence linked to the recent protests in the country. The defendant was sentenced by Iran's Revolutionary Court for reportedly setting a government building on fire. According to a human rights group, another 20 defendants are facing charges punishable by death. Meanwhile, a separate court handed down 5 to 10-year prison sentences to 5 others. Iran has seen nationwide protests sparked by the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini on September 16th, after she was detained by Iran's morality police for not wearing a hijab correctly. According to figures provided by Iran Human Rights, at least 326 protesters have been killed by security forces. Meanwhile, in the U.S., 3 students have been killed and another 2 injured in a shooting at the University of Virginia. All 3 killed were football players for the university. One of the injured is in critical condition. The incident took place on Sunday evening local time on a student bus at the university's Charlottesville campus parking garage. The students were returning from a field trip to Washington, D.C. at the time. The suspected shooter, a former member of the school's football team, was taken into custody the following day. And finally, $180,000 for 950 grams. This was the exchange made for Italian white truffles sold at the Italian Alba White Truffle World Auction in Piedmont on Sunday. The northwestern Italian region is famous for the natural growth of white truffles. The new owner was able to claim the sought-after delicacy after making a winning bid during the event, which was also open to offers from Seoul, Singapore, Hong Kong, Vienna and Doha. The white truffle is more highly prized compared to its black truffle counterpart because it cannot be grown on plantations and is only found in natural forest settings.
Good morning. It's a much chillier start to the day. We can see our breath in the cold. The morning temperatures are 4 to 5 degrees lower than the same time yesterday. And chilly winds are making it feel far colder than what the thermometer points to. And inland regions are waking up to a sub-zero start. Then there could be light precipitation west of central regions from late afternoon into late tonight. Rain could turn to sleet in mountainous regions. But the rest of the country will be under mostly sunny skies. Afternoon highs will be similar to yesterday in most parts, but chilly winds will make it feel colder than extra temperatures. Seoul and Chuncheon going up to 13 degrees, Busan, Jeju at 17 degrees this afternoon, and air quality will be decent nationwide. No major cold snap for this year's Sunung test day, but beware of wide gaps in readings and dress in layers. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And that'll do it for New Day at Arirang, but stay with Arirang News for more updates throughout the day. Take care.
동백섬에